Hello, hello, good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm so used to saying good afternoon for these Fridays, and now that I'm in an actual morning time, I can actually say good morning to everybody. Uh, Whatever your time zone is, morning, afternoon, such. Um, as you can tell, I'm still in the United States. It's actually fun in some ways and nerve-wracking at the same time to do these lives from different locations. I forget how comfortable my setup at home is, with everything in front of me. And but this keeps me on my feet, keeps me going. All right, I hope you are ready. I actually have no idea what we're in for. I mean, I know what the paper is. I know what its title is, and I know a little bit about it, but I actually have no idea what we're going to find when we get into it. So I have prepared my tea, which is good. And I have my stuff prepared. I hope you have had a wonderful week. I have to say that it's been a challenging week, which is good. I mean, it's really pushed a lot of my boundaries in good directions. Lots of evaluation, lots of things going on, and lots of reading. I don't know about you, but for some reason this time of year, my way of escapism and relax is to read, even though I'm not reading lots of different things, but it's been awesome. Anyway, we're not here to really chit chat about any of that stuff, are we? We're here to just get into the meat of this, especially because this paper is a little bit long. Now, I found this paper. I actually don't remember how I found this paper. I think it came through an email. It is a paper from 2018. Let's just share my screen and get into this. Let's see. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. All right. Here it is. Actually, let's do it this way. Okay. Hopefully you can all see it now. It's coming in. Yes, it is. This makes me a happy little camper. I am closing off some other things because my computer is attempting to ding at me, and I do not want to hear any of those dings while I am here with you, because that's what we do. I focus on you. Okay, so as you can see from this paper, it is called, hello, there you are. This is a paper from Environmental Philosophy. And as you know, I don't know about any of you before we started onto this track, but before we started on this track, I think I had not underestimated the importance of the fields, certain humanities fields, philosophy fields, all in the work, in the environmental movements that we're talking about. I mean, last week we talked about queer ecology and all of the aspects of queer nature. Today, we're talking about environmental philosophy, which includes things like poetry. And I really am enjoying all of how the humanities are stepping into this, how philosophy really helps set the tone or helps kind of give us certain directions. Really, if there is a field that knows how to embrace their weird, in my opinion, it is philosophy. If there is a field that does not know how to embrace their weird, I would say that that's neurobiology, but that's just my opinion, completely my opinion. I think that the philosophers are having way too much fun embracing all of their weird and really being able to express and experience and think about and ponder certain concepts. So I am definitely a philosopher of heart. I have discovered this. I am a philosopher at heart. And who knows, maybe at the end of the paper, you will be too. So this is a 2018 paper in the environmental philosophy. It is by somebody named Mark Payne, which honestly, I didn't look him up, and maybe afterwards I will. And it is called Poetry, Vegetality, and Relief from Being. Now, in this particular case, well, no, in general, vegetality has been, and I'm sure he's going to go in and define it somewhere, but basically vegetality of living beings is really your plantness. It is a direct kind of synonym. Vegetality is often used in more of the academic fields. Michael Marder uses vegetality and to really get into the concept of your plantness. But anytime you see vegetality, that's what we're talking about, plantness, the ability, your vegetal self or your plant self. There is a big movement in the academic world to go more towards vegetality. And I think because vegetality really does give a broader perspective on the kind of vegetal state, not vegetable, vegetal state. I do also think, though, that speaking of our entire conversation that we have all the time around getting kind of new paradigms and words, I even catch myself as we're so used to using terms like a vegetative state, which have, of course, a negative connotation, the idea of laziness or of kind of being unconscious or things like that. I feel like that's one of the first words. Vegetative, I think, has unfortunately just taken a really bad rap and is one of those terms that we need to rethink, redefine, reconquer. I don't know, something about it, because I don't think it really helps us. But anyways, let's get into this and let's go and see where Mark Payne is actually going to take us. So the abstract is, in ancient Greek ecological thought, vegetality is the most basic ground of life. Now, here what he's really referring to is Aristotle's scala naturae, which that we've talked about so many times, which is the concept that you have this scale that starts with the mineral world and then moves towards the vegetal world and then moves up to the animal world and then with humans up on top. And this is a hierarchy which goes from least conscious or inert all the way through to conscious thinking, actualized beings, or beings that are able to be actualized. I'm not so convinced, actually none of us are really convinced nowadays that let me say this way. Aristotle put this scale in place thousands of years ago and it has stuck, and that's what sucks. That's what we're really fighting against, is the idea of this sort of hierarchical thought process that your evolution, that the evolution of the world goes from I am nothing, I am rock, all the way through to I am human, which is I am everything, and there's these scales in between. We know this to be false now. We know that the advent of plant, neurobiology, of all of the plant intelligence, of all the plant consciousness that we've been talking about, we know that this scale is not accurate, but it is the standard paradigm. So it is what is thought of. And it's not that it was all ecological thought. So this first line is even a great example of the fact that it was not all of the Greek scholars that believed in this concept that vegetality is the most basic. But Aristotle was just so vocal about it and really put it into play and wrote books. And so therefore it is like the gold standard, which is why we have to work against that. We have to break down this scale and really redefine it in terms that make more sense, which is not about a hierarchy, but instead about differing types of intelligence. So I don't know where Mark Payne is going to take this, but as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this because it's such a frustrating topic to think that one person really set in motion so much separatism, so much of like what we think of today as right and wrong in the sense of intelligence. It's just amazing to me to think one person could have been so influential. Anyway, it is followed by animality and rationality as increasingly active, self-aware forms of life. The traditional scale, it frustrates me. I believe I have a picture of it in Reconnect with the plant kingdom in the course, because I do talk a lot about this and I've talked about it so much in other lives. Okay, I'm not going to get derailed anymore. Sorry. Focus. An ontology of forms of life need not justify a hierarchy among actual living beings, but in practice, it often does. This paper shows how the poetic representation of plants resists this slippage. Ooh, now I already like this line. Poetry offers human beings an ecstasis from their own animality, so they can apprehend their participation in the vegetality of living beings as a whole. Okay, this is going to be one of those papers, I already can tell, where the poet has chosen not just to be poetic in their poetry, but to be poetic in everything. So it's going to have lots of alliterations and lots of metaphors and lots of symbolism. It's going to be rich in words. So I might need your help to help me decipher some of these, because if not, I'm going to be running to the dictionary on a regular basis. In ancient Greek ecological thought, vegetality is the most basic ground of life. I'm not going to get derailed this time. It is the principle of growth and self-perpetuation common to all living beings as subjects of life. being tasked with sustaining their organismic existence as the first task of that life. In the tripartite Aristotelian schema of living, see, this is like big words. Aristotelian schema of the living, vegetality as a form of life is followed by animality. The operation of perception, appetite, and self-motivation in certain kinds of living beings allows us to recognize them in a selective conation akin to our own, and thus to distinguish this form of life from vegetality alone. Animality is in turn, so the operation of perception, appetite, and self-motion in certain kinds of living beings allows us to recognize them in a selective conation akin to our own, and to distinguish this form of life from vegetality alone. So in this case, it sounds like he's using vegetality in its older perspective of like the idea of unconscious, I guess. I wish he would have defined this. I mean, I think if you're going to start with something like this, you should give definitions. Animality is in turn followed by rationality, because guess who's supposed to be rational? I think people who work in the legal professions and in certain other professions might argue that we shouldn't just ascribe rationality to all human beings. I just think that that would happen if we actually took a poll, but I'm curious what you think about it. In the operation of certain kinds of intellection, do you think this guy uses big words just for the sake of big words, or do you think he really thinks this way? Again, okay, I'm going to stop. Sorry. We recognize a similar distinctiveness in the lives of gods and human beings, continuously in the case of the gods, discontinuously in the case of human beings. Okay, who only occasionally avail themselves of the capacities that the gods make use of all the times. Well, this is the concept that we talk about, the fact that you are a divinity, but you've forgotten, and therefore you need to remember. Let's see what number 2 is. See Aristotle on the soul and Martyr on the Threpticon. I told you that he got the vegetality word from martyr. I have avoided soul terms in my translations here because they inevitably suggest that something separable from the body, like the Christian soul, rather than a faculty of life that is inseparable from the living substance in which it's active. Well, that's your choice, right? I mean, I understand that choice, but some would say that the soul is separate from the body and that the living substance is active and they're connected, but then they can be separated upon life or upon death, okay, I'm going to move on. The ontology of forms of life need not become the justification for hierarchy among actual living beings, but in practice it often does. Vegetality may appear as a mode of deprivation with respect to animality. We obviously don't believe that. Just as animality in turn may appear as a mode of deprivation with respect to rationality. And we definitely don't believe that either. The recognition of distinctive forms of life can be used to legitimate a scale of being ordered according to a valorized, according to a valorized sequence of capacities. Plants at the bottom, followed by animals, human beings, and gods. See, it's funny because every one of these thinks there's something else, right? Well, I don't know about animals, but we talk about plants and the fact that plants are alive and akin to everything. Well, human beings are always trying to be gods. I think it's just funny. According to this version of the schema, vegetality is not simply the common denominator of the living, but its lowest common denominator. I'm going to drink so as not to comment too much. What is at the bottom of a ground of relationality among living beings may instead be taken a principle of separation between them. Agreed. But what about mineral world? Because in the Scala Naturale, the mineral world is below. I don't know. Let's see where he goes. The aim of this paper is to show how the poetic representation of plants, both in antiquity itself and in the European literary traditions that looks back to it, pushes back on the all too easy slippage from an ontological distinction between forms of life to a hierarchy of actual living beings. Vegetality is the form of life common to all living beings, but it is difficult for human beings to access this common ground. Yes, I agree with this statement. That's a very good statement, because that's why we're always working here to reconnect to our plantness. Like other animals, they are mostly caught up in the selective conation that perception, appetite, and self-motion afford. And when they are not, their potential for rationality is an additional hindrance to the apprehension of their own vegetality. Their aspirational form of life leads them even further from the basic ground of life. In order to apprehend their own vegetality, human beings require a suspension of or ecstasis from animality that can lead them back towards their shared life with living beings as a whole. Yeah. Oh, I just realized I can't highlight this in what I'm using. I can copy it, but I can't highlight it. What a shame. Interesting. I like this line. In order to apprehend their own vegetality, human beings require a suspension of or ecstasis from animality that can lead them back to their shared life with the living beings as a whole. Basically, we have to forget our animal roots, our animal aspects. I would even argue beyond that, but it's a close direction. I'll get there in a second. In order for us to remember that we are part of nature, because living beings as a whole, i.e. living beings as a whole, nature overall. And so in order to apprehend, in order to really dig into our own vegetality, to our plantness, we have to forget kind of everything we've been taught. They must be reoriented, and poetry is able to supply just such an enabling pause. Poetry de-emphasizes the forward movement of narrative time in favor of an expansive present tense movement. It diffuses the self-experience of the individual human animal as a set of conative projects unfolding over time into the ubiquitous presence of shared life. In this paper, I suggest that we call the suspension of the narrative self-experience relief from being. Oh, I get what he's trying to say. By this, I mean freedom from two distinct but relational obligations. The first is the obligation to cast human life in narrative form in order to find significance in it. As Galen Strawson has argued, narrativity has come to have a quasi-normative authority for self-understanding in the humanities. But apprehending our lives as a relation of the distinctive characters and actions is not the only way in which we experience their significance. By relating individual life to the common ground of vegetality, poetry relieves us of the obligation to equate significance with distinctiveness. In its strongest form, it may even articulate the perception that vegetality, or plantness, in its charismatic, instantaneous as tree and flower, sometimes leans in to relieve us from the burden of animality as singular being. This is quite powerful. Okay, now I'm starting to understand. So basically, I don't know if you got it, but correct me if you understood something different, right? You're allowed to write in the chat whatever you're thinking about. But relief from being basically says that poetry gives us the ability for us to step out of our need as human beings, as evolved animals, because right from the scala naturae, that's kind of the idea. We evolved out of animals beyond. And we have to force meaning onto everything in order to be, right? The whole idea that we need significance, and that it is that significance that allows us to really understand and tap into our divine self. So we become fully functional gods when we give meaning to everything, which is really one way of being it. The other way is that when we instead take relief from being, in other words, when we step out and rather than having to make meaning into everything, recognize that the meaning is a basic tenet of life. In other words, that I just have to be, and that my presence and my ability to be is just as powerful and godlike as the need for me to equate significance into everything. Then we touch our true essence of being nature. In other words, we as elements are natures. Our plantness is the part of us that is. And in some ways, I'm going to follow this thread with me for a second. Just follow this thread for me for a second. I'm not really sure where I'm going with it, but I'm going to try, and I'd love your feedback on it. So in some ways, if you think about it, our humanness is about meaning, right? We as human beings, we ascribe meaning to everything. Our animalness is about instinct. Our animalness gives us the ability to react, to respond, to create certain types of experiences based on that innate knowing. Our plantness gives us a sense of being, a sense of true connection. And again, I'm not talking about being a plant, being an animal, being a human is this. I'm talking about the essence of this differentiating sets of, I don't want to even call intelligence, but more of who we are, elements of ourselves. And if we can think about that as like our plants give us our beingness, our plantness, our vegetality gives us our beingness, our animalness gives us our instinctual nature, our humanness gives us our significance pieces of nature. And I still think that, by the way, plants have a humanness and plants have an animalness. So again, I'm not talking about the individual species. I'm talking more about a differentiation of the essence of being, of the true, of the natural, I don't even know how to say it, because all the words are freaking polluted because they've all been used in so many different ways. But hopefully you're following what I'm trying to get along to. And it is all of this that gives us our divineness, right? Our godlike sense, because we can tap into all of this. And I do think that there's a part of our mineralness, our rockness that we here in NCC don't explore that much because we're just starting to kind of like connect and expand into this, and because it becomes a really big conversation. But I do think it's an important conversation to have. And I think that the same thing happens to like our fungi-ness, which I think we're going to over the years discover, and our bacteria-ness and our virus-ness. I think we're going to start to put all these elements of the natural world that we are a part of and that we are simultaneously living within and derived from in some ways. It's like this whole huge pool of what is, quote, nature with the capital N, that makes up this whole piece. I don't know. It's starting to make sense in my mind. Now you're getting a glimpse into what happens in my brain when I start going off on threads. Like, so I don't know, hopefully it was an interesting thread for you, but that's where we are. Okay, I'm gonna get back into this because if not, we're never gonna forget. We're never gonna finish. Okay, sorry. The second is the obligation to make sense of our self-experience in relation to being as such. And I like that it's being with a capital B. It is with this sense in mind that I have derived the term relief from being, from Heidegger's being and time, and use it here with a double compass. Senselatsun appears in the discussion of the they world in sections 1.4 of Being and Time, where it looks to be a nonce formation, a nominalization of the freedom from care that each human being experiences in social life as a way of shunning the call to articulate its relationship with being. A nominalization of the freedom of care. Okay. Thus, the particular day scene in its everydayness is disturbed by the they. Not only that, but thus disburdening of its being. And they accommodate Dacian if Dacian has any tendency to take things easily and make them easy. And because the they constantly accommodate the particular Dacian by disburdening it of its beings, the they retains and enhances its stubborn dominion. Okay, that's the German, which I don't know how to read, and I'm not going to. The register seems to be the physical sciences. An entity that might buckle or break under the demands of its local deployment is able to divert some of its load-bearing responsibilities onto environmental supports. Dacian stress originates with being, not beings. Heidegger is not speaking here of the melancholic's entombment among the things of life as it is imagined in, for example, Baudelaire's Ennui. The person who looks up and finds himself alongside the same couch, the same table, the same children's toys in the same place where they were a moment ago experiencing the world as a dull, ontic frame onto which he is unable to project the story of his own life. The animal vitality that realizes itself in desirous conative project feels itself set back by the bars of a vast prison. Mere persistence has taken the place of self-experience in narrative form, and the melancholic subject seeks relief from this oppression anywhere out of the world. Oh, they're just... Okay, I was just reading the thing to see. What calls for Seissenlatzen is not an occlusion of animality, that is experienced as a cravings for the otherworldly. Perhaps the familiar feeling of ennui, so ennui, boredom, way more than that, dullness, induced by beings, is the form in which the desire for relief presents itself. But behind the impressiveness of beings is the oppression of being itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? What stance do I take towards this obscure donation? These are the questions from which Desines seeks relief in the they world. But poetry has its own ways of reckoning with the obscure donation. Poetry deflects Desines' obligation to articulate its relationship with being, being as in my being, being just is, onto living beings as a whole. It is within this horizon of relief that the apprehension of vegetality as a feeling of solidarity with whatever else is alive appears as both a proxy for and an alternative to the relationship with beings as such. And among actual living beings, it is plants' apparently total, choice-free identification with the process of life, in contrast to animals' selective involvements in conation projects that allows Desines' relationship with them to stand in for its relationship with being itself as the unmotivated appearance of what is. These are heavy words, okay? I'm trying to think of, this is one of those cases. So here you're getting a little glimpse into my process when I read. As you know, I read obviously tons of papers. In order to be able to come up and select one a week for you, you can't even imagine how many I have to go through. And in some cases, I go through them really detailed. In some cases, I just kind of do a cursory look to identify whether or not they can work or not work based on where we're going and what we're looking at together. And I love papers like this, and I hate them simultaneously. I hate them because obviously doing something like what we're doing today is difficult because I have to try to put things into words, give you an understanding, share with you my thoughts. But the problem is that what I love about these types of papers is the fact that there almost are no thoughts. Michelle's saying, I think he just loves language and that's how he chooses his words. I agree with you, Michelle. I do think that this man loves language and that's the way he chooses words. But in this choice of words, he's also showing the absurdity of parts of the English language. And I think that this is also an important thing for us not to gloss over, in the sense that the English language has charged or has overpowered, has given too much responsibility to too few of words, right? Words like nature, your nature is in my personal way of being, versus nature is in the world outside and what I'm seeing in the kind of things that are not necessarily man-made. Nature as in so many different, like with a capital N, with a lowercase n thought of. And being is another word that has that same perspective, right? Being is a word that has been overcharged. So what happens is that when you start to step into these types of philosophical musings, you have to parse through not only your own concepts and emotions and trains of thoughts and training and conditioning that you're breaking, at least for me, I can literally feel the bonds of it like breaking apart, in order for them to me to look at the words, not from the words themselves, but more of what sits behind the words. And in this case, this is really fascinating to think about the idea of what is the essence of being for each of the different types of beings. So what does that essence mean, whether you were talking about it as being or as nature itself? I think he could have used relief from nature with a capital N, like my personal nature. I also think, and so you need to break apart those bonds and allow them to sit on their own and digest them and let them kind of roll through you and test them out in different parts of you. Like, do I test them out in how to feel on my body? I test them out as what I think about when I take these concepts and I apply them to other things that I have used. I have to think about them in a contemplative sort of being state, right? Where I don't try to understand them, but I just let them be a part of me. And so in order to bring them back into a language and structure and a thought process that neither rejects as a priori, but neither rejects it, but neither does it completely bring it in and let it all become truth, because we still don't know. This takes time. And this is part of the beauty of these types of papers, of going through them, is really about it. Like, this concept of me, of what is the beingness. It is true that even in my own spiritual practice, right, we believe that to divinitize matter is about giving meaning to everything. But giving meaning to everything, as it's being implied here, is too much, because it's like having to give everything a narrative. And that's not the type of giving meaning that's impossible. I mean, it is impossible. It's too much. It's flooding the mind with another job, and mind in the widest sense of the word mind, with another job, as opposed to meaning. Being is a form of meaning. And when I embrace my vegetality, when I embrace my plantness, I give myself the opportunity to be, and I allow that meaning be made from being, not having to write a narrative over it. And I have to say that to get there has been a process. I am a hyperactive, super energetic person who loves words, as you already know, and hopefully love to, and loves the concept of giving things a meaning, and to have found meaning in the quiet spaces, to find my meaning without definitions, but just in the essence of being, has been a huge conquest for me. And it's still not there all the time. It just sort of wafts in and out. So I can understand that what he's trying to say is that poetry allows us to connect to that vegetal quality, which is not inert. It is not unconscious. It is in an active state of being, without the need of adding extra meaning to it or external significance. The significance is just the being itself. Gosh, I hope that was understandable to all of you. Like, I really do, because it's not easy. This is where I am in my thinking process, and it's not clear yet. This is all me talking to you in real time. And this is the kind of processing that I do, right? I sit there and I think about this in this way, and I might write a little bit here, and I might draw a little bit over there, and I might dance or move or let all of this wash through my body. Because here I'm doing it obviously through my mind, through my verbal skills. And that is a big part of it for me, because I am a verbal person. So that does help me. But then I might take it into another language. I might then stop with the words and let it come through my body in a different way, and soften my gaze and allow things. And you'll notice that I gesture a lot. I move a lot. And yes, it's because I have a lot of energy, but it's a lot of it is, this is another way I process. I process by the movement of my hands, by the way my body, I mean, there's a lot more going on here that you can't also see. My legs are constantly moving. I'm terrible to go to the movies with, by the way. Terrible. I move constantly. And so this is a way of me processing also. I process it somatically. And I'd love to hear how you process this. Like, how do these types of things sort of roll through you in order for you to not use only conditioning and minds and words to like assign meaning, but to allow those concepts to ferment inside of you. All right, let's keep going. As Michael Martyr has shown, the idea that plants exhibit a complete identification with the process of life, in contrast to animals' capacity to pick and choose among cognitive projects in a way that plants cannot, has at times been despised and at times idealized in the history of Western thought as vegetal indifference. Vegetal indifference looms as a temptation on the horizon of Dasein. By allowing a biologically rooted freedom from need to be imagined and adopted as an ontological freedom from self. Biologically rooted freedom from need. Why is it considered a biologically rooted freedom from need? I mean, without a doubt, plants do not have the ability to pick and choose certain experiences because they have to take whatever comes to them there. But I wouldn't say that that is biologically rooted freedom from need. It's on the contrary, it's biologically rooted need to address everything. That's like the opposite. A form of Seisenslang has always been operative in vegetality as a temptation of a life of improper freedom from the projective existence of animality. I don't know if that's true, man, but that's fine. What I want to consider here is how, in poetry at least, the relief from animality the vegetality affords is also operative as Seisenslang in Heidegger's second sense, a displacement of Dasein's relationship with being onto its shared life with living beings as a whole. Okay, so as Dasein's experience itself as surrounded by other subjects of life rather than the lifeless ontic frame of ennui. Okay, I can see this. It's a shared life with living beings as a whole. In other words, I am feeling my wholeness as all the aspects of my nature rather, and therefore, because I am experiencing the whole, I no longer have to add specific type of meaning, because you're adding specific meaning only, I'm forcing specific meaning when I only have a partial, and so therefore I have to fill the gap with my own meaning, as opposed to if I am experiencing the whole, because I am biologically rooted to have to be in the middle of the whole, then it's not lifeless or boredom or lack or unconsciousness of ennui, but instead it is fullness and richness of being. I don't know. What do you think? Am I on the right track? Here, then, at the outset of Western poetry is an example of the way in which the poem invites plants to lean in and affords us, its readers and listeners, the frisson of an encounter with our own vegetality. As the fighting before Troy grows ever more intense, the warrior invites another to take a break from the action and to reflect on the ways in which their own coming into being and passing away is in common with plants. Obviously, I'm not going to be reading the Greek. The generation of men is like the generation of leaves. The wind spills one lot on the ground, and then the trees put out another in their place when spring comes. So one generation of men grows up and passes away, and another passes away. This is an ecstatic movement in the narrative. To this point, we have been captivated by the frantic deployment of human energies in the service of narratable projects of self-realization, the self-memorialization in the singular that the Greeks called kleos, fame that lasts through generations because a person has distinguished himself from others by the deeds of a singular life. Now this ambition is reframed by looking aside from the arena of human striving to the larger horizon of living beings as a whole. The generations of human beings that spend their lives in pursuit of fame are fundamentally subjects of life in the same way as trees that spill their leaves to the ground without a thought for their singularity. At a moment when the question, what are we doing here, is suddenly operative, vegetality occupies the horizon of being. Bruno Snell claimed that the work of the emergent anthropos in distantiating itself from its surroundings was still in progress in the Homeric poems. In Homer's comparison on the front rank of an army to a rock that endures the wind and waves, it is not correct to say that the rock is viewed anthropomorphically, unless we add that our understanding of the rock is anthropomorphic for the same reason that we are able to look at ourselves petromorphically. Petromorphically. My God, I love that word. For the act of regarding the rock in human terms furnishes us with the means of apprehending and defining our own behavior. Who is that? Number 7, Snell. How should we understand this claim here in relation to Homer's trees? Elsewhere in the Homeric poems, cultivated plants, including trees, are encountered in the modality of care. The cultivator's anxious concerns for his plantings is a figure for the tender care that parents have for their children. Here, by contrast, a vague background of uncultivated plant life is a figure of relief from such care. Plants lack care for their own being. Look at that face. Do we believe that? Plants lack care for their own being? No, that's not true. They just have a different form of care, but I'm going to keep going. As it is figured in the indifference with which they shed their leaves, contrasts with the anxiety with which projective beings, humans and God alike, seem to perpetuate themselves through their offspring in a multi-generation extension of their own existence. Okay, I think here we're going to have to give Mr. Mark Payne a little bit of a lesson, because it sounds like he's making some assumptions, which I think hold him back from fully being able to embrace the greatness of some of the arguments that he's making. In the sense that it is not that plants lack of care for their own beings, okay? It is that plants have a much different relationship with their own beings. How I have come to understand it, and as always, you are all welcome to correct me, change, ask questions, and give me your own thoughts. I am not the end all be all, but I think it's important for us to, I throw the first stone. I throw out the, I don't know, I was about to use really bad metaphors and they're really bad ones, so I'm not going to do it. I want to throw out a first kind of draft, which is that plants have a relationship with life and death. And this goes very much to the claim of relief from being. Relief from being in the sense of relief from human being. Maybe even relief from animality, maybe, but I'm not 100% sure because I'm not an animal expert, so I can't speak. But I do think that plants have a greater understanding and a greater connection to the cycles of life. And, we talk about this in Reconnect with the Plant Kingdom, right? It's all in the module on life and death. I think that plants have a relationship with life that allows them to, I'm going to anthropomorphize here because I'm going to bring it from what my experiences with plants as a person who did not start off in the way that I'm telling you, anything with a lot of fear and completely opposite. But I think that what I have learned in my relationship with plants is there is an understanding that these cycles of life or death are the way that our systems were built, right, for today. And while we as human beings, and as well as many other species, are learning about how to live longer lives, right, and enjoy, it is not about the length of a life. It is about the quality and the character of that life. And the quality of the character of the life is not even necessarily predicated upon what challenges you may or may not have, what diseases or instances. It is really about the way that you experience each one of those and what you gain from it. So even something that can seem horribly painful or disturbing and such, never encouraging any of that to happen, never encouraging it, but at the same time can be a force for a really good life when put through a different lens. Wow, that's incredibly hard to say in human terms. So hopefully you're getting what I'm trying to say, which is, and so it is true that plants shed their leaves, and that you have trees that, send their seeds far and wide. And even though their seeds are technically their children, some of those seeds they know are going to be eaten, and that's okay too. And it's because there is a significance that is just different. It is really about living, and about living in whatever form that life takes. Wow, this is incredibly hard. Why did I pick this? I am only on page 5. Okay, it's just hard. So I say it because I think that his argument is really a good argument in a lot of ways, and especially when he's looking at the uncultivated plant life, but it is not relief from such care. I would say that this is a background of uncultivated plant life is a figure of relief from worry, or from fretting, or from wallowing. I think that that's the difference. Because plants have to deal with the life that is given to them, they have a humongous advantage over us humans in their ability to carry through that, and to find the experience necessary to have through that. That's how I'm going to put it. The vegetality of trees is imagined as a form of life in which one might have a non-connotative, non-desirous relationship with one's own being, accepting its coming into being and passing away with indifference as simply another instance of living substance through which life passes and is gone. And here with indifference, remember, I mean, we've had this conversation, I think, in different commentary, and I've had it in the podcast, and I've had it in some of our plant-inspired master classes. We've talked about indifference tends to be looked at from an English perspective and a human perspective, with the wording of like, indifference is, I don't care. Indifference, from an Italian perspective, or from, like, for example, a Damanhurian perspective, is I am not attached. Indifference is I put myself out there and I do whatever it is that I need to do, and then I take whatever comes back and I do the best that I can. I use it, I enjoy it, I experience it. I am not attached to what it is, and I am not forcing something that I think is correct when it might not be correct. So I look at this word indifference, through which simply another instance of living substance through which life passes and is gone. I would say more like through which life is experienced, because that's really what it is. Indifference allows us to experience the present rather than getting caught up in what should be or what could be. It is thus that vegetality's relief from animality shades into Seissenslung. As such, I don't even know how to say that word, by the way. As you can tell, I'm starting to just blur it through. The Iliad's trees invite the listener to feel their way into a relationship with being in which this relationality is enacted simply as living. Exactly. Enacted simply as living. By inviting the anthropos to experience itself as living substance, the poem invites it to entertain for itself an undifferentiated ontic status as one living being among others. Yes. It displaces the obligation to articulate a response to the obscure donation of what is onto the feelings of solidarity with living beings as a whole. Yes, this is feeling yourself as a being of nature. What the Iliad imagines in this turn to vegetality or plantness is a form of life that is self-assured in its indifference to its own being. Yes. So that it can easily bear on our own ambiguity in this regard. Vegetality is a refuge from the oppressive obligation to give an account of ourselves in the singular, and in a singular relationship with being. Yes, it is about the whole. Again, this is the reason why I included in Reconnects with the Plant Kingdom both sections. One is around being an individual. You're an individual, an interrelated individual. When I step into my plantness, I recognize myself as an individual in the sense that I am differentiated by the experiences that happen to me. but my source material is of the whole, so therefore I'm always part of that whole. And so I know I am never alone, and I am actually never non-existent. I always have an individuality inside of an interrelated complex. And I can see why poetry gives much more leeway to this experience, because it gives me the opportunity to use my own, because of the shortness of words, because of the lack of words to a certain extent, it gives the reader the opportunity to define these terms on their own stances and to express, to live this without some of the oppressive nature of the narrative world that feels like it has to design everything. Whoa, now I understand why this guy loves words. There's a lot of need for thinking about words in order to come to these understandings. Okay, pastoral poetry grows out of this epic insight. It selects out of the relief from animal conation and ontic singularity that vegetality affords, and makes it the basic trope of its fictional world. Vegetality becomes a way of thinking, physis, the coming away of thinking, physis, the coming into being and passing away of what is, as fully vegetal in nature, the mode of being of a living cosmos. Where Homer says that by looking aside from human striving to the lives of trees, one can better understand what it is for a human being to come into being as a subject of life. Pastoral makes this moment of attention to the background of human action and the central fact of its world. The resetting of human action in nature, with a capital N, as a fully living horizon for this action is primarily meaning-making event of pastoral poetry. Ooh. Theocritus's Idyll 1 is the foundation document of this genre in antiquity. Two herdsmen sit beside a waterfall, listening to the music of a stream. As they listen, their words begin to fit themselves to the rhythms of the water and the movement of the wind in the trees around them. The trees' speech becomes their speech. They no longer need to talk. In fact, they reflect. Perhaps they ought not to talk, in case their dialogue should disturb the rest of Pan. Pan, the god of the territorial god of our world, of our physical environment, the quiet being of the all. Plotness, at the end of the Platonic tradition, makes falling silent before nature's generativity a sign of attunement to it. Exactly. If anyone were to ask nature why it makes, if it cared to hear and answer the questioner, it would say, "You ought not to ask, but to understand in silence. You too, just as I am silent and not in the habit of talking." Okay, sorry. Much has been made of the influence of the setting of Plato's Phaedrus on the invention of pastoral poetry, but there is more at stake than just mise en scène. The herdsman's conversation is a kind of falling silent in language, an erasure of dialect as the effort to give an account of oneself in the singular. The more the herdsmen talk, the more they leave themselves behind, and the sorrows of Daphnis, song that occupies the second half of the poem, is the first sustained enactment of the pathetic fallacy in Greek poetry, the first really extensive representation of the participation of non-human life in human suffering, so that this participation makes the poem in which it appears an occasion of relief, consolation, and even a kind of muted elation. All of this is taking on completely new meanings to you. Completely new meanings to me. I don't know about for you, but definitely for me, there are things I had never even considered when reading these types of poems. Although I have to admit, I've only read a few of the ones that he's mentioned. So I don't know about you, but long epic poems, Greek poems, and just parts, and little parts of Heidegger, little parts of some of the different, not all of it. Homer's momentary invitation to the natural world to lean in and reframe the cognitive animality of its warriors becomes, in pastoral, the foundational possibility of a fictional world. In pastoral, all living beings can regularly be expected to show explicit symptoms of the relationality that binds them together as subjects of life through the basic ground of vegetality. Death, loss, and longing are all to be enjoyed to the extent that they are occasions for the discovery of a consolation in shared life that is not invented. See, that's what I was saying. Death. See, I used 100,000 words. He uses one sentence to say the exact same thing. Death, loss, and longing are all to be enjoyed to the extent that they are occasions for the discovery of a consolation in shared life that is not invented. The herdsman did not project, invest, or imagine feelings in a lifeless ontic frame. Rather, they discover in their individual losses the possibility of re-relating their self-experience to the larger network of shared life to which they belong. And that little paragraph was everything that I said in like 20 minutes before. In pastoral, the regular participation of non-human life in human feelings is not a mythological thought in the sense that it requires a living cosmos in which we can no longer believe. It is rather an ecological thought in that it is scalable to whatever we think is alive and how we think this life might share the burden of our own life with us. The active participation of plants and animals in human suffering is a way of underscoring the sympathetic nature that binds all living beings together through the common ground of their vegetality. Pastoral's rhizomatic recurrences in Western poetry are not enchanted recursions to a vitalist mythology, but enactments of the relief we are occasionally afforded when we experience our lives as common subjects of life. As the editors of a recent collection of postmodern pastoral put it, the pastoral is one of our culture's oldest and most enduring simulacra. But like any simulation, pastoral contains within it a kernel of critical negativity that, when properly activated by the poet and reader, promises to put us in touch with the reality or realities of our contested world. The extremity of pastoral's fictional framing is what makes it ecstatic project legible. It is a clear directive to the anthropos to reorient itself from its captivation by its own animality to the larger horizon of living beings as a whole. I don't even have much to say because I have to say now I'm sort of getting into this and this whole way of thinking, which is somewhat foreign to me, and I don't necessarily I am not a great scholar of ancient poetry, as you can just imagine. But I am trying to understand how do they even get there, by the way? Do you ever wonder that? I mean, seriously, how much poetry must you read in order to understand this at the level? I mean, I can agree with what they're saying and I can take from there and extrapolate it out into other areas of life. And I've probably said the same thing in different ways, but I would have never thought of it in the context of poetry. I don't know about all of you. I'm just curious. The herdsmen of pastoral poetry risk the clear outlines of singular being in making non-human lives the bearers of their self-experience. And this distinctive figuration of selfhood as risk is even more obvious in the romantic and post-romantic poetry that looks to pastoral for its forms of shared life. John Clare's Lament of Swarty Well, never heard of it, for example, is spoken by a piece of common land, a ferny declivity that has continuously fostered the poet's self-experience through time. As an adult, he has a reflective understanding of the constitutive role of the non-human life forms it fosters in his own sense of self. The only life worth speaking of for the poet in his shared life with the bent, the dotted, the landrill, and the moldywort. And with the loss of Swarty Well, to enclosure there remains only the condition of sad non-identity that he names in An Invite to Eternity. Sad non-identity. An abstract, unsustainable chronotrope of selfhood in which the poet wanders in time, lacking the possibility of a return to the present without the support of cathexis to a terrain. Would this be in some ways when they are completely disconnected from self? Like the non-identity is really about the full disconnection from your plantness in this particular case? These acts of relationality are enabled by the pastoral genre in which Clare understood himself to be working, but are now first personal in a way that classical pastoral, with its third-person dramatic characters, is not. In Recollections After Ramble, Clare echoes the way in which classical pastoral singles out consolation of nature that is only ever a moment of distraction in epic as the basis of its poetic world, while emphasizing that this consolation has been his own. Rurality, I dearly love thee, simple as thy numbers run. Epic songs may soar above thee. Still, thy sweetness yields to none. Cots to sing and woods and vales, though it's all thy reed can do, with the nature shall prevail, when epic war harps broken too. Clare's poetry clarifies what is at stake for the perdurance of self-experience and pastoral staging of sacred life with other living beings as the basic possibility of the genre. Rather than a background that occasionally leads in to refrain our animality as an ecstatic moment, Clare's poetry stages through loss the ways in which this silent background is at times a carrier and support of our self-experience. For Clare, this support is irreducibly particular. He acknowledges the plant and animals that live alongside him with an understanding of an agricultural worker and amateur naturalist. Other poets who have looked into the pastoral tradition have instead embraced it for the way in which it acknowledges a vagueness in our apprehension of vegetal life, and from the indistinction horizon of vegetal life in which it frames the animal conation. As I'm reading all this, you know what I'm thinking about? I am thinking about, so if you remember when we read, oh my God, the Overstory, right? When we read the Overstory, when we read Richard Power's book, many of us, not all of us, but many of us had this feeling that, yes, there are these trees in each one of these stories. Yes, there is this commonality that comes, besides the fact that it's a ridiculously sad book in a lot of ways. But there was this, of course, there's the whole nature connection and the whole piece around. And as I'm listening to or reading this and I'm thinking about it and I'm letting it sort of digest through me, I am starting to wonder what that book would have looked like had he ever tried to write it as an epic poem. Because I wonder if that would have allowed him to get more to the essence of what in parts has been said that he was trying to get to with the plants, with the actual trees, and allowing the trees to be the center focus of being for each one of these individuals who are experiencing their beingness in very different ways. I just keep I can't help but think about what this would actually have been like as an epic poem, and if this would have given Powers more space to tell the story from the perspective of the trees, to tell the stories from the perspective of the plants that were involved in it. Curious thought, huh? I mean, I don't think I would have read it if it was an epic poem. Well, maybe an epic modern day poem. Maybe. Would have had to be read much slower, and it couldn't have been as long. Oh. Okay, sorry, I got sidetracked. And we're kind of almost at the end of our time today because there's no way we're going to go through the whole thing. We're only on page 8. Let me look and see, is there a natural stopping point? No, there is not, because it goes on to page 18 and we're only on page 8. So I'm going to see if I can figure out a nice stopping point that makes sense, because we're already an hour in. André Dubuchin was an editor of the, actually where I am is a good stopping point now that I'm thinking about this. Yeah, we're going to stop it right here, because I feel like if we keep going, we're just going to get into another section. And I don't know, What do you think about what we're doing? Like, do you like it? Do you find it interesting? I find this really interesting. It's totally making me think completely differently than what I expected. I did not at all expect that this would take so long, but I also didn't expect it to kind of churn so many different thoughts. I might read it. I warn you, I might read it in advance just to see if there's like some of the really poetry stuff that maybe for those of us that aren't poetry like expert scholars, I could skip. But just because I want to make sure that we close it. Yes, Michelle, the cadence of the language he uses is poetic too. Yeah, you could tell that really he has become a scholar. And I think as we go into it, he sort of loosens up from some of the really descriptive word, like some of the words, in order to recognize that this is a paper rather than an actual poem in and of itself. But I do agree that his language is also poetic. And I'm very curious, and this is something for you all to think about between now and when we come back to finish this paper next week, is what is the best way for you? I'm super curious. If this thing allowed me to do polls, I would ask it as a poll. What is your best way of consuming poetry? Because I find that I love poetry when I hear it. Like if I go to a poetry reading, I really enjoy that. And I really enjoy poetry when it's kind of in a shared context, like what we're doing right now. But I have to admit that if I'm reading poetry by myself, like a book type thing, I don't read it. It has to be a singular focus and a time of like read and just sit with it. So I think this is the other piece that for me is really resonating in what we're talking about, is that this is resonating with how I read poetry and what I get into it. Yeah, I have to read it out loud. Like I have a Hafiz book and that I love to just open the page and whatever comes, whatever page I'm in, just read that poem and just read it out loud and just sit with it. And maybe that is that relief of being that he's talking about. Maybe that is exactly that vegetality of like, I don't have to sit there and dissect it and be like, this word means this thing and this word means this thing. And therefore I have to just let whatever unveils in front of me based on what I'm reading, whatever may come of it. And it might be the completion of, maybe the completeness of what the poet expected of me. And it might just be partially, but I think that that's also the timelessness of poetry, is the fact that it allows us to reread a piece of poetry multiple times and each time just see a different image of it. Anyway, I'm going to stop here because I can keep going, it sounds like, which is good. This is the mark of a good paper, where I'm stimulated and I'm thinking about all these different pieces and I really feel like I can connect on multiple ways. So we're going to meet back here next week. Are we meeting next week? Let me just double check, because there's some weeks where we skip because we have some things. No, we are meeting here next week. We will be next week at the same bat place, same bat time. We're going to meet here. We're going to finish up this paper. I'm excited to see where he's going to go with it. I did not expect myself to get so excited. At the beginning, I was a little worried that I had picked badly, but at least it's stimulating me. So we shall see. I will post a recording if you're watching this recording. Thank you for being here. Remember that we're here every single Friday. And please make sure you can RSVP, you can find all of the events, you can tell your friends to join if they really enjoy this, and we will see each other again next week. Bye-bye for now.